Welcome to another deep dive. Get ready to explore a world where ancient plants, they weren't just remedies, but like powerful symbols.
Yeah, woven into myths and beliefs.
All about sexuality and fertility. And our guide, it's John M Riddle's book, Goddesses, Elixirs, and Witches.
It's packed with insights from, ancient Sumerian myths, Egyptian papyri, even medieval folklore. So buckle up.
Yeah, it's going to be quite a ride. What I find fascinating is how these ancient cultures had such deep knowledge of the natural world.
It's true. They didn't just stumble upon the effects of these plants, They actively incorporated them into their lives, their rituals, and even their understanding of how the world worked.
Right, so let's start with a fruit we usually think of as being pretty, well, healthy, I guess, the pomegranate. But when we look back at ancient Mesopotamia, things get a little more complex.
Yeah, exactly. Riddle actually connects the pomegranate to, well, that famous Uruk vase.
One of the earliest artifacts we have.
Right, that one. And he looks at the hulupu tree that's depicted on it.
Yep, sure.
It's a controversial theory. But he argues that the pomegranate, specifically the seeds, was used as a contraceptive.
Wait, a contraceptive? I mean, that seems to suggest they had knowledge about plant chemistry way back then, more than we might expect, I guess. What evidence is there to support that?
Well, we see Babylonian texts describe pomegranates being used in love magic. So that hints at an understanding of, well, how they could influence relationships, right? And there's even more compelling, a pharmacist's vademecum. It's a kind of, like an ancient reference guide. And it specifically mentions using pomegranate seeds for women who didn't want to get pregnant.
So we have textual evidence suggesting that the pomegranate was more than just a fruit. It was potentially a way to control fertility.
Now, of course, other scholars look at the hulupa tree and they interpret it differently, suggesting it represents a more general control over fertility, not just contraception. But even that points to a deep awareness of the plant's power.
And it's not just ancient Mesopotamia, right? The pomegranate pops up in another story that a lot of us are pretty familiar with, the Garden of Eden.
Ah, the forbidden fruit, the one Eve bites into.
Exactly. So Riddle suggests that maybe it wasn't an apple at all, but a pomegranate. Because the Hebrew word that gets translated as apple could actually refer to any golden fruit.
And the pomegranate certainly fits that description, right? I mean, its Latin name even means grained apple.
So instead of picturing, that shiny red apple, maybe we should be thinking of a yellowish-brown pomegranate hanging for the tree of knowledge.
It definitely changes the image.
It does. But does it change the meaning of the story at all?
Well, I think it adds a really fascinating layer of symbolism. Don't forget, the serpent in both the Inanna myth, the one with the hulupa tree, and in the Genesis story, is associated with fertility and knowledge.
Right.
So if we think about the forbidden fruit as a pomegranate, it kind of suggests that maybe it represents the knowledge and the power to control fertility, which is a pretty potent concept, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And both stories involve disobedience, right? Which leads to knowledge. So eating the pomegranate, or whichever fruit it was, could symbolize gaining knowledge that allows humans to make conscious choices about reproduction. It kind of puts a new spin on the idea of original sin, doesn't it?
It definitely does. And it makes you think about how these ancient cultures might have viewed women's control over fertility, not as something sinful, but as a form of power, a form of knowledge.
Okay, so we've seen how the pomegranate plays a role in these ancient beliefs about fertility. Let's move on to a plant that has a reputation for being even more potent, the mandrake.
Ah, the mandrake. With its human-shaped root, it's no surprise that this plant has, it's captivated imaginations for centuries, from ancient Egypt to, even Harry Potter.
Oh, right, those screaming mandrakes. They were pretty memorable. But beyond all the fantastical imagery, what was the mandrake actually used for in these ancient cultures?
Well, in ancient Egypt, it was considered to have erotic significance. In fact, it even shows up in love poetry. And just like the pomegranate, it was believed to enhance fertility.
So we have this plant that not only looks like a human, but it's also linked to both love and fertility. No wonder it inspired so many myths and legends.
Exactly. But what if its supposed effects on fertility weren't due to, some magical property? What if it was something more subtle? Riddle actually proposes this fascinating theory. What if the mandrake actually worked by reducing stress?
Stress reduction. That's an interesting angle. How would that tie into fertility?
Well, we know today that stress can have a big impact on conception. Maybe the mandrake, with its calming and sleep-inducing properties, help to create a more relaxed state, which could then have a positive effect on fertility.
So even back then, people understood the connection between mental and physical well-being.
And that makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other seemingly magical properties of these ancient plants might have a more practical, yet still very profound explanation?
We've been talking about plants that were thought to promote fertility in ancient times.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're on to the chaste tree, a plant with a name that kind of hints at something a little different. What's the story here?
Well, the chaste tree, as you might guess, was believed to suppress sexual desire, especially in men.
Really?
Yeah, and the ancient Greeks, they even used it in their religious rituals, to promote chastity.
So it's like the ancient world's anti-aphrodisiac. But was there any scientific basis for that, or was it just, folklore?
Well, it's interesting because there is some evidence to back it up. There have been studies that show that the chaste tree can suppress sexual activity and spermatogenesis in male rats.
Spermatogenesis.
Yeah, that's the process of sperm cell development.
Oh, okay.
So, it seems like the ancient Greeks might have been onto something with their beliefs about the chaste tree.
But here's what I don't get. If it was all about suppressing desire,
Yeah.
why was it also sometimes called the female herb?
That's where it gets really interesting, because the chaste tree was also believed to have powerful effects on women's bodies.
Really?
Yeah. Specifically, it was used to promote menstruation, and some people believe that it might have even been used to induce abortion.
So the same plant could be used, it could have these totally opposite effects.
Yeah, pretty much. It really shows how complex these ancient cultures, how they viewed the natural world, and how they used it.
Right.
Oh, and there's another layer to this story, too. There's this Greek myth about Hermes.
Hermes, the messenger god.
Yeah, well, he was also the god of animal husbandry. And in the myth, he gets tied up with chaste tree binding.
That seems a little ironic. The god associated with flocks and herds, tied up with a plant that suppresses reproduction.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it might actually give us a hint about how the ancients understood the chaste tree. Maybe they saw its potential to control animal reproduction. They could have used it to manage the fertility of their flocks, to create a balance between breeding and population control.
So they weren't just using it for human needs.
Yeah, it's possible they were thinking about the well-being of their whole ecosystem.
That's pretty amazing when you think about it, that kind of ecological awareness. So from promoting fertility to suppressing desire, we've seen how ancient plants played a big role in shaping these beliefs and practices around sexuality. Mm-hmm. But our deep dive isn't over yet. We have one more plant family to explore.
And it's a pretty famous one. At least some forms of it are pretty well known. We're going to talk about Artemisia, which is more commonly known as wormwood. Yep. And it has a long history of medicinal uses and some surprising connections to art and even literature.
Wormwood. I think I've heard of that. Isn't it mentioned in the Bible something about its bitterness?
You're right. It is. It's definitely known for being bitter.
Right.
But there's a lot more to it than that. It has this fascinating history of medicinal uses, especially when it comes to women's health.
Really? So what was it used for, besides making things taste bad?
Well, they used it for all sorts of things, like breathing problems, hemorrhoids, and, worms.
Okay.
But what's really interesting is how it relates to women's health. Artemisia was used for menstrual problems, and they even used it to help with childbirth.
So it's like a motherly plant taking care of women.
Exactly. And what's even more remarkable is that this ancient plant is still relevant today.
Is it?
Yeah. One of the most exciting things about Artemisia is that it's a source of artemisinin, and that's a really effective treatment for malaria.
Wow. So this ancient plant, it went from being, shrouded in myth and folklore to actually helping us fight a global health threat. That's pretty amazing.
It is. It really shows how important it is to study traditional knowledge, and to protect biodiversity. Who knows what other secrets these ancient plants might hold.
Before we move on, you mentioned that Artemisia had some not so desirable qualities too.
Yeah. Some species of Artemisia can actually have hallucinogenic effects and narcotic effects.
Mm.
You probably heard of absinthe, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The drink that supposedly drove artists and writers crazy.
That's the one. And it was made with wormwood, along with other herbs, and it had a pretty high alcohol content, plus the psychoactive compounds from the wormwood. So it was pretty potent
Good.
and sometimes pretty unpredictable.
So this mother herb had a bit of a wild side.
Yeah, it did. And it reminds us that even plants that have beneficial effects, they can still have some pretty powerful effects. And we need to be careful with them.
It's like walking a tightrope, trying to use their power for healing, but also being aware of the potential for harm.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you wonder how much of the fear and all the superstition surrounding these plants, especially all this stuff about witchcraft, came from just, misunderstanding them or maybe misusing them.
That's a really good point, and it's especially important to think about when we consider that a lot of the women who were accused of witchcraft back then, they were the ones who knew about plants.
Really?
Yeah, they were the healers, the midwives, the women who understood how the natural world worked, and they were often seen as suspicious,
Right.
dangerous. Their knowledge was a threat.
It's almost ironic. The very thing that could have been used to help people, to heal them, it was turned against them.
Exactly. It was a time when fear and superstition they really took over, and it makes you think about how easy it is for society's anxieties to shape how we see the natural world.
Well, we've covered a lot, from ancient plants and sexuality to even the darker side of human history. But there's one more piece to this puzzle. We need to talk about elixirs.
Yes, elixirs. Those magical concoctions that they promised everything, didn't they? Eternal life, boundless power, everything humans have always wanted.
So were they actual potions, or is it more of a metaphor? Did people really believe that they could brew something up that would let them cheat death?
It's kind of both. The idea of the elixir of life, it has roots in ancient alchemy, and there were traditions all over the world, from China to India to medieval Europe. And while it's easy to be skeptical today, back then there were alchemists and healers who dedicated their lives to trying to create these elixirs. They really believed that if they could just understand how the natural world worked, they could unlock its secrets and do all sorts of amazing things.
That's pretty incredible. But how does this connect to the plants we've been talking about?
Well, a lot of those elixirs were made from plants, plant extracts. And in the medieval period, the idea of wonder drugs, substances that could heal almost anything, it got really tied up with the idea of elixirs.
So all these plants that were already connected to, sexuality and fertility and healing, they became even more important. It's amazing, really. These plants that we just kind of take for granted. I see them in our kitchens, in our gardens, but they were once at the center of this whole world of beliefs about sexuality and fertility, even life and death.
It's a perspective we've kind of lost, We tend to look at plants through a scientific lens now, all about their chemicals and their medicinal properties. But ancient cultures saw them differently. There was this sense of magic, this aura. They connected them to these big mysteries like life and death and the cosmos.
And as we've seen, that magic, it wasn't always a good thing. I mean, sometimes it led to fear, suspicion, even persecution, especially for those who understood the power of these plants.
That's right. Knowledge can be dangerous, right? Especially knowledge that challenges the way things are. Makes you wonder how much we've lost over the centuries, how much wisdom, how much understanding, all because of fear and ignorance, and the suppression of people who knew things that others didn't want to hear.
We've covered so much in this deep dive. The pomegranate and its connection to fertility and knowledge in ancient Sumeria, the mandrake and that interesting theory about stress reduction, the chaste tree and how it affected both men and women, and then there's Artemisia, the mother herb, with its medicinal uses and its darker side with absinthe, and now it's helping us fight malaria. It's been quite a journey.
It has been, and to think we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to learn about ancient plants and how they relate to sexuality, fertility, health, even spirituality.
It feels like we've opened a door to this hidden world, a world where plants weren't just part of the scenery. They were active participants. They shaped human lives and beliefs in these really, really profound ways.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this topic so fascinating. It makes us rethink how we see the natural world, and it helps us appreciate the depth of knowledge that these ancient cultures had.
So what's the one thing, the one takeaway that you hope our listeners will walk away with after this deep dive?
I hope they'll come away with a sense of wonder and curiosity. I want them to look at plants differently, really see them, think about the stories they hold, appreciate the ways that humans and plants have been connected throughout history. It's really amazing when you think about it.
That's a really great way to put it, and I think it's the perfect note to end on. So to all our listeners out there, I encourage you to keep exploring, keep digging deeper into the world of plants. You never know what secrets you might uncover. Go explore.